On his birthday, a millionaire realizes he has no one to celebrate with. Alone in a crowded restaurant, he feels the weight of a life without real connections. But an unexpected invitation from a mother and her daughter completely changes that moment. And this simple gesture reveals something that money could never buy. If this beautiful story of overcoming and love interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you are watching us from. Continuing, Eduardo Mendes always knew exactly what he wanted. From a young age, he had a clear vision of success and pursued every goal with relentless determination. He built his empire from scratch, transforming a small technology company into one of the largest conglomerates in the country. At 43 years old, his name was on the lists of the most influential people in Brazil. His signature moved millions, and his decisions impacted thousands of jobs. He had everything society considered important, everything except what truly mattered. On that Thursday in September, Eduardo woke up like any other day. The penthouse apartment in the Jardins region of São Paulo was silent, too silent. The large windows revealed the city moving below, people rushing to their appointments, cars clogging the avenues, life pulsing on every corner. But inside, only the discreet sound of the air conditioning broke the emptiness. He got up, prepared his coffee as he always did, and looked at his reflection in the window glass. 43 years old, his birthday. There were no calls in the morning, no special messages. His secretary had sent a formal congratulatory email, as had some company executives. Automatic messages from banks and companies wishing him happiness. Nothing more. Eduardo had no living parents, he was an only child, he never married, and his relationships had always been superficial, interrupted by the priority he gave to business. True friends. Those who existed in his youth had drifted away over the years, tired of always being the second option, of refused invitations, of unfulfilled promises. What remained were acquaintances, partners, co-workers, people who respected him but did not know him. During the day, he immersed himself in meetings. He analyzed spreadsheets, closed contracts, and made decisions that would affect the future of his company. This was what he was good at. This was where he found purpose, or at least that was what he tried to believe. When the clock struck 7 in the evening and the last meeting ended, Eduardo dismissed the driver. He wanted to drive. He wanted to feel some control over something different from the usual. He took the keys to his imported car and left the office with no set direction. The streets of São Paulo were busy as always. Heavy traffic, the lights of businesses turning on, people walking hurriedly. Eduardo drove aimlessly for a few minutes until hunger made him think about dinner. He didn't want to go back to the empty apartment. Not that night, not on his birthday. He decided he would go to a restaurant, alone as he had been doing for years, but at least he would be surrounded by people, by movement, by life. He remembered an Italian place he used to frequent in Vila Madalena, a place that wasn't flashy, but had good food and a welcoming atmosphere. He redirected the car, faced the typical traffic of the region, and finally parked. As he got out, he adjusted his tie out of habit, even knowing he didn't need to be so formal. He walked to the entrance of the restaurant, where the discreet facade hid a cozy interior. The receptionist greeted him with a professional smile. Eduardo asked for a table, but she looked at the system and made an apologetic expression. The restaurant was full. There was a waiting list, and the estimated time was at least an hour. Eduardo hesitated. An hour waiting alone just to dine alone. The idea was almost comical in its sadness. He thought about leaving, looking for another place, maybe just ordering something to go and going home. But something made him stay. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the refusal to accept that he couldn't even have a birthday dinner. He sat on a bench near the entrance watching the movement. Couples entered holding hands, families with excited children, groups of friends laughing loudly. Every person there had someone. Every table was a celebration of bonds, of presence, of company. Eduardo felt out of place, like a stranger watching a life that wasn't his. He checked his phone a few times, answered work emails, anything to look busy, to not look like what he really was. A man alone on his birthday, waiting for a table that might not even be worth it. It was then that he heard a soft voice. A woman approached the receptionist, accompanied by a girl of about 8 years old. The woman had a simple appearance, hair tied in a ponytail, modest but well-kept clothes. The girl held her hand enthusiastically, her eyes shining with expectation. They asked for a table, and the receptionist repeated the same information. It was full. There would be a wait. The woman looked at her daughter, who made a disappointed but understanding expression. They talked quietly, and Eduardo realized they were considering leaving. But the girl insisted, pulling her mother by the hand, and the two sat on another bench near the entrance, willing to wait. The child swung her legs, excited, telling her mother something with exaggerated gestures. The woman smiled, participating in the conversation with genuine attention, even though exhaustion was visible in her eyes. Eduardo couldn't help but observe. There was something in that scene that touched him in a strange way. The simplicity of the interaction, the spontaneous joy of the girl, the affectionate patience of the mother. It was something so far from his reality that it seemed to belong to another world. He found himself thinking about what it would be like to have someone like that by his side, someone who would wait for a restaurant table with him, who would share those small moments of the day. The receptionist called a few people from the list, and gradually the restaurant accommodated those who were waiting. When she finally called Eduardo's name, he stood up, but something strange happened. Instead of feeling relief, he felt a pang of sadness. He was going to dine alone while that mother and daughter, who clearly had far fewer resources than he did, waited their turn to share a moment together. The injustice was not in the external circumstances, but in the irony that he, with all his money, had no one to share a meal with. The receptionist led him to a table in the corner, a reserved and quiet spot. Eduardo thanked her and sat down, but he couldn't focus on the menu. His eyes returned to the entrance, where the woman and the girl were still waiting. They were talking animatedly, oblivious to the wait, creating their own world there on that bench. For the first time in a long time, Eduardo Mendez felt small. Not small in status or power, but small in something much more fundamental. He had built an empire, but he had not built a life. The waiter approached, but before he could take the order, Eduardo made a gesture asking for 1 more minute. He looked around the restaurant. All the tables were occupied, all full of conversation and laughter. He was there, alone at a table for 2, while outside there were people waiting. People who, unlike him, knew the real value of being accompanied. An idea began to form in his mind, something he had never considered doing. It was risky, it could be misinterpreted, but at that moment on his lonely birthday, Eduardo felt he needed to do something different, something that would break the pattern of isolation he had built around himself over the years. He stood up and walked to the entrance. The receptionist looked surprised, thinking something was wrong. Eduardo passed her and went straight to where the woman and the girl were sitting. The two looked at him with curiosity and a slight apprehension. Eduardo took a deep breath, feeling strangely nervous, and said in a voice that tried to sound casual. He asked for permission, explained that he was alone at a table, and noticed they were waiting. He said he would be happy if they wanted to join him, that the table had space, and it made no sense for him to occupy it all alone while they waited. The woman and the girl exchanged surprised looks. There was a moment of uncomfortable silence where Eduardo almost regretted the initiative, but then the girl smiled in that frank and unfiltered way that only children can, and looked at her mother as if asking for permission. The woman hesitated, studied Eduardo carefully, trying to gauge his intentions. He noticed the weight of that look, the maternal protection, the natural distrust. Then he added, with a sincerity that surprised even himself, that today was his birthday, and it would be a gift to be able to share the table with someone. This last sentence seemed to melt the resistance. The woman looked at her daughter, then back at Eduardo, and accepted with a timid smile. They stood up and followed him to the table. Eduardo pulled out the chairs for them, an automatic gesture of courtesy, and sat down again. The receptionist watched the scene with a confused expression but said nothing. There they were, 3 strangers sharing a table in a busy restaurant in São Paulo on a night that began lonely and was now gaining completely unexpected contours. The girl was the first to break the ice. She introduced herself as Isabella, but asked to be called Isa. The mother, with a more formal but polite tone, said her name was Cristina. Eduardo introduced himself only as Eduardo, omitting the surname that carried weight and recognition. At that moment, He didn't want to be the businessman, the millionaire, the name in the newspapers. He wanted to be just someone sharing a table. The waiter brought the menus, and Eduardo noticed Cristina studying the prices carefully. She chose something modest, as did Isabella. He felt like saying not to worry, that he would pay for everything, but something in her look stopped him. There was dignity in that choice, a silent firmness that deserved respect, so he also placed his order, and the menus were collected. In the first few minutes the conversation was shy, punctuated by polite smiles and uncomfortable pauses, but Isabella, with that childish spontaneity that knows no social barriers, began to talk about her day at school. She talked about a presentation she had done, a drawing that received praise from the teacher, how proud she was for getting a good grade in math. Cristina listened to her with attention and visible pride, asking questions and celebrating every small achievement as if it were the greatest victory in the world. Eduardo watched them fascinated. That love, that complicity, that celebration of such simple things, it was a completely different universe from his, where achievements were measured in figures and contracts. There, a good grade in math had the same weight as $1 million deal, and somehow in that context it made perfect sense. When the food arrived, they ate in a more comfortable silence. Isabella commented on everything, making Cristina smile and even drawing a few laughs from Eduardo. He found himself relaxing, releasing the tension in his shoulders, allowing himself to be present in that moment, without thinking about work, commitments, or the responsibilities that always occupied his mind. At one point, Isabella directly asked why he was alone. Cristina gently scolded her, saying that one doesn't ask that kind of question, but Eduardo shook his head, saying it was okay. He answered honestly that he had no family, that work had always been his priority, and that over the years he ended up distancing himself from people. Isabella made a thoughtful expression and then said, with that disconcerting frankness of children, that she thought it was sad to be alone on a birthday, that birthdays were for being with the people we like. The simplicity of that observation hit Eduardo like a punch to the stomach. He swallowed hard, feeling a lump in his throat he couldn't explain. Cristina lightly touched her daughter's arm, as if asking for caution, but Eduardo smiled and said that Isabella was completely right. He confessed that yes, it was sad, and that for the first time in a long time he was admitting that to himself. Dinner continued with a lightness Eduardo hadn't experienced in years. He asked questions about their lives, and Cristina, little by little, began to open up. She said she worked as an administrative assistant, that she raised Isabella alone, that life wasn't easy, but they did their best. She said that dinner was a small celebration because Isabella had passed a school selection to participate in a special project, and she wanted to celebrate her daughter's effort. Eduardo listened to every word with genuine attention. There was beauty in that struggle, in that dedication, in that ability to find joy in small victories. It was a wealth he had never achieved, despite all his millions. And at that moment, sitting at that table, sharing a meal with two strangers who welcomed him without asking for anything in return, Eduardo Mendes began to understand that he had spent his entire life accumulating what didn't matter and neglecting what was essential. The conversation flowed with surprising naturalness. Eduardo found himself laughing for real, something he didn't do often. Isabella had a unique way of telling stories, mixing exaggerated details with sharp observations that didn't seem to belong to an 8-year-old. Cristina watched her with that discreet pride that only mothers know, correcting an exaggeration here and there, but allowing her daughter to shine in her own way. Eduardo discovered that Cristina worked in a small accounting firm in the east zone of São Paulo. She woke up early every day, took Isabella to school, took 2 buses to work, and repeated the reverse route in the late afternoon. The routine was exhausting, but she spoke with determination about every achievement, every improvement they managed to reach. She had saved for months to be able to provide that dinner for her daughter, as a way of celebrating the effort Isabella had shown in her studies. Isabella, in turn, studied at a public school but participated in every project available. She loved to read, was fascinated by science, and dreamed of being a veterinarian when she grew up. Her eyes lit up when she talked about animals, how she wanted to help abandoned pets, how she thought it was unfair that some didn't have a home or food. Eduardo listened to that genuine passion and vaguely remembered when he himself had dreams like that, before the ambition for financial success consumed everything. The waiter brought dessert, a petit gâteau that Isabella had ordered enthusiastically. The girl savored every bite with a joy that made it seem like she was tasting the best sweet in the world. Cristina ordered only a coffee, saying she was satisfied, but Eduardo noticed how she watched her daughter eat, with that look of someone who feeds on the happiness of others. He realized that dinner had probably cost a significant part of their budget, and he felt a tightness in his chest, thinking about how he spent without thinking on meals that cost 10 times more and didn't bring a tenth of that satisfaction. When they finished, the waiter approached with the bill. Eduardo took it immediately with an automatic gesture, but Cristina firmly extended her hand. "No," she said politely, but with unshakable determination. She had invited her daughter to dinner, it was their celebration, and she would pay. Eduardo tried to argue, saying that he had invited them both to the table, that he insisted on paying, but Cristina did not yield. There was pride in that refusal, but it was not empty pride. It was dignity. It was the affirmation that she was capable of providing for her daughter, of fulfilling what she had promised. Eduardo stepped back, respecting that position. He realized that insisting would be disrespectful. It would be taking something important away from her. So he just thanked them for the company, for the conversation, for the moment they had shared. Cristina smiled more relaxed now and said that they were the ones who thanked him, that it had been a special night in a way they didn't expect. Isabella, however, became restless. She looked at Eduardo with a thoughtful expression, then at her mother, then back at him. Cristina noticed and asked what was happening. The girl then said in a low voice, but clear enough for Eduardo to hear, that she didn't think it was right for someone to spend their birthday without even getting a little cake with a candle, that everyone deserved at least that she wanted to do something. Cristina tried to gently dissuade her daughter, explaining that they had already done a lot by sharing dinner, that Eduardo would certainly understand. But Isabella shook her head stubbornly. She took the small bag she was carrying, a pink children's purse with unicorn drawings, and pulled out some crumpled bills and some coins. Eduardo immediately recognized what that was. It was her allowance, probably saved over weeks, kept carefully to buy something special. The girl called the waiter and, with an adorable seriousness, asked if they had any individual cake she could buy with that money, and if it could come with a little candle. The waiter looked at the bills and coins in the small hand, then at Cristina, who was clearly surprised and moved, and then at Eduardo. He smiled kindly and said yes, they had it, and he would bring it right away. Cristina held her daughter's hand and tried to make her put the money away, saying she didn't need to, that it was hers, but Isabella was irreducible. She said that the gentleman was alone on his birthday, and that was sad, and that she wanted to make him happy, even if just a little bit. The girl's voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from contained emotion, from that absolute certainty that children sometimes have about what is right and wrong. Eduardo felt something break inside him. It wasn't a bad feeling, it was different. It was as if a wall he had built over decades was cracking, letting through a light he had forgotten existed. He wanted to say something, wanted to thank her, but the words wouldn't come out. He only managed a nod, accepting that unexpected gift. The waiter returned a few minutes later with a small chocolate cake, simple but beautiful, with a lit candle in the center. Isabella took the plate carefully, as if she were carrying something precious, and placed it in front of Eduardo. Cristina had teary eyes, clearly touched by her daughter's gesture, but also proud of that spontaneous generosity. Isabella then began to sing Happy Birthday, softly at first, but with growing enthusiasm. Cristina joined her, their voices mixing in that simple song that echoed amidst the murmur of the restaurant. Some people at nearby tables noticed and smiled, touched by the scene. Eduardo looked at those two people, practically strangers a few hours ago, singing Happy Birthday to him with a sincerity no one had shown in years. When they finished singing, Isabella clapped and told him to make a wish before blowing out the candle. Eduardo closed his eyes. He didn't know what to ask for. He had everything money could buy, but at that moment, sitting there with those two people he barely knew, he realized that what he really wanted was something that cannot be bought. He wanted connection. He wanted belonging. He wanted to feel that his life had meaning beyond the numbers in the bank. So he made that wish, in silence, and blew out the candle. Isabella celebrated as if it were the greatest victory, and even Cristina smiled broadly. Eduardo cut the cake into 3 pieces, insisting they share, and this time Cristina did not refuse. They ate that simple cake together, which for Eduardo tasted like the most valuable thing he had received in a long time. It wasn't about the cake. It never was. It was about the gesture, about the purity of that intention, about the fact that a child who had so little chose to use what she had to bring happiness to a stranger. When they finished, it was already late and the restaurant's crowd had thinned. Cristina looked at the clock and said they needed to go, that Isabella had school the next day, and they still had a long way home. Eduardo felt a pang of sadness, realizing that moment was coming to an end. He didn't want it to end. He didn't want to go back to the empty apartment, to the silence, to the loneliness that now, after that experience, seemed even more unbearable. He accompanied the two to the restaurant exit. The night was mild, typical of São Paulo in September, with a slight chill in the air. Cristina thanked him once more for the company, and Isabella gave Eduardo a hug that caught him completely off guard. It was a tight hug, the kind children give without measuring strength, full of genuine affection. He hugged her back, feeling a lump in his throat that threatened to turn into something more. When Isabella pulled away, Eduardo looked at Cristina and said he would like to take them home, to ensure they arrived safely. Cristina hesitated, and he noticed the natural distrust returning. Then he added with sincerity that he had no ulterior motives, that he would just feel better knowing they were safe, that it was the least he could do after everything. Cristina studied his face for a moment, looking for signs of falsehood, and apparently found none. She said they would take the bus and that she lived far away in the East Zone, that he didn't need to bother. Eduardo replied that he had a car and it would be a pleasure to take them, that it was no trouble at all. He insisted gently, without pressure, and finally Cristina agreed. They walked to where Eduardo had parked. When Isabella saw the imported car, her eyes widened. It was a model she had probably only seen in movies or magazines. Eduardo opened the doors, adjusted the seats so they were comfortable, and followed Cristina's instructions regarding the address. While he drove through the streets of São Paulo, Isabella didn't stop asking questions about the car, about how it worked, about the top speed. Eduardo answered patiently, finding amusement in her childish curiosity. Cristina in the passenger seat was quieter. She looked out the window, watching the city pass by, and Eduardo could feel that she was still processing everything that had happened that night. Every now and then, their eyes met in the rearview mirror, and there was a silent communication there, a mutual recognition that something unusual had occurred. The trip took almost an hour, crossing São Paulo from one end to the other. Eduardo passed through regions he rarely visited, neighborhoods that were completely different from his world of penthouses and glass-walled offices. He saw life happening in ways he had forgotten existed. Families sitting on the sidewalks enjoying the cool night, bars full of lively conversation, children playing despite the hour. There was life pulsing there, a different life but equally valid, equally rich in its own way. When they finally arrived at the address, Eduardo parked in front of a simple building, well kept but modest. Cristina thanked him for the ride, and Isabella, already sleepy but still excited, also said goodbye. Eduardo said the pleasure had been his, and he really felt it. He stayed there watching the two enter the building, Isabella waving before disappearing through the door. When they were out of sight, Eduardo remained there for a few minutes, hands on the steering wheel, looking at the building. Something had changed in him that night. He didn't know exactly what, nor could he name it precisely, but he felt it was profound. For the first time in years, he had experienced true connection, generosity without interest, genuine affection. And now, returning to his luxury apartment, he knew that the void that had always been there would be even more evident. He drove back to Jardins in silence, immersed in thought. Upon arriving home, the apartment was exactly as he had left it, impeccable, organized, empty. He sat on the Italian leather sofa, looked at the walls decorated with expensive works of art, at the designer furniture, at everything he had accumulated, and he felt that none of it mattered, absolutely nothing. He picked up his cell phone and stared at the screen for a long time. He wanted to send a message to Christina, thank her again, maintain that contact, but he didn't have her number. They hadn't exchanged information, they hadn't established any form of communication. Perhaps it was meant to be just that, a chance encounter that happened and ended, leaving only a memory. But Eduardo couldn't accept that possibility. For the first time in a long time, he had found something he wanted to preserve, something he felt could give meaning to his life. He didn't know how, he didn't have a plan, but he knew he needed to find a way not to let that connection be lost. He spent the night awake, reliving every moment of that dinner. Isabella's smile, Christina's dignity, the gesture of the cake with the candle. Every detail was engraved in his memory with a clarity he rarely experienced. And for the first time in his 43 years, Eduardo Mendez went to sleep feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than he had allowed himself to believe. The following days were strange for Eduardo. He returned to his usual routine, to the endless meetings, to the decisions that moved millions, to the appointments that filled every minute of his schedule. But something had changed. Where before there was only mechanical focus, now there was distraction. His mind constantly returned to that night, to that unlikely dinner, to those two people who had entered his life so unexpectedly. He thought about Isabella, the purity of that gesture of using her savings to buy a cake. He thought about Christina, the silent strength with which she led her life, the dignity with which she refused help, keeping her pride intact. And he thought about himself, how that encounter had exposed a truth he had been avoiding for years. His life was empty of everything that really mattered. On Wednesday, 5 days after the dinner, Eduardo made a decision. He took the car and drove to the East Zone, to the address where he had dropped off Christina and Isabella. He didn't have a clear plan, he didn't know exactly what he would do, but he felt he needed to try. He parked in front of the building and stayed there, watching the movement of the street, trying to gather courage for what he intended to do. He was almost giving up when he saw Christina leaving the building. She was wearing simple work clothes, a shoulder bag, and was walking toward the bus stop in a hurry. Eduardo got out of the car before he could think too much. He called her name, and Christina turned around, startled. It took her a few seconds to recognize him, and when she did, her expression mixed surprise with apprehension. Eduardo approached quickly, with his hands raised in a gesture of peace, explaining that he didn't want to scare her, that he was just passing through the region and thought of saying hello. It was an obvious lie, considering the East Zone was far from anywhere he would have a reason to be, but it was the best excuse he could come up with at the moment. Christina studied him for a moment, and then her face softened. She asked if he wanted anything, if something had happened. Eduardo shook his head, suddenly feeling foolish. He said that actually he just wanted to thank her again for the birthday night, that it had been special in a way she probably didn't imagine. Christina smiled, a small but genuine smile, and replied that for them it had also been special, that Isabella hadn't stopped talking about the gentleman from the restaurant and the beautiful car. There was a somewhat uncomfortable silence, and then Eduardo noticed she was looking nervously toward the bus stop. She said she was going to work and couldn't be late. Eduardo, on an impulse, offered a ride. Christina hesitated, the distrust returning to her gaze. He understood the reaction. He understood that a woman alone had every right to be cautious with a man who appeared out of nowhere, even if they had met before. Then he added with sincerity that he understood if she preferred not to accept, that there was no problem, but that he would be happy to help if she allowed it. Something in the way he spoke must have convinced Christina, because she agreed, on the condition that it was clear it was just a ride, nothing more. Eduardo agreed immediately. During the ride to the office where she worked, they talked. Christina told him more about her daily life, about the challenges of raising a daughter alone, about how difficult it was to balance work with motherhood. Eduardo listened attentively, asking genuine questions, truly interested in understanding that reality so distant from his own. She in turn asked about his work, and Eduardo answered vaguely, saying only that he had a technology company. When they arrived at the office, a modest building in a commercial area, Christina thanked him for the ride. Eduardo said it was nothing, and then, gathering courage, asked if he could have her phone number. Christina stopped in the middle of the motion of opening the door, looked at him with an expression that was hard to decipher. Eduardo quickly explained that he would like to keep in touch, that he thought they could be friends, that he had no ulterior motives, he just appreciated the company. Christina was silent for a few seconds that seemed eternal. Then she said she needed to be honest with him, that she was grateful for the attention, for the kindness, but that she wasn't looking for anything, not a complicated friendship or anything beyond that. That her life was simple and she liked it that way, that she didn't want any trouble. Eduardo felt his heart tighten, but he respected what she was saying. He said he completely understood, that he didn't want to cause discomfort, that he just felt they had made a connection that night at the restaurant. There was something in the way he spoke, perhaps the vulnerability that showed in his voice that made Christina reconsider. She sighed, took out her cell phone, and dictated the number. But she made it clear that if there was any inappropriate behavior, any attempt to cross boundaries, she would block him immediately. Eduardo agreed, thanked her, and watched her enter the building. He stood there for a few minutes, looking at the number saved on his cell phone. He felt like a teenager who had just gotten the contact info of someone special. It was ridiculous, he knew, a 43-year-old man, successful, powerful, feeling this way because of a phone number. But it was real, it was genuine, and somehow that mattered more than any deal he had closed in recent years. He waited until evening to send the first message. He spent hours thinking about what to write, discarding versions, rewriting. Finally, he sent something simple. He thanked her again for the ride she had accepted, hoped the workday had been good, and sent a hug to Isabella. Christina replied a few hours later, politely but briefly. The day had been busy. Isabella sent a hug back. Thus began an exchange of messages that over the days became more frequent and more personal. Eduardo was careful not to be invasive, not to send messages all the time, to respect Christina's space. But gradually she began to open up. She told him about her day, about Isabella's antics, about small events that on the surface seemed trivial, but that carried the essence of a life lived with attention to detail. Eduardo, in turn, began to share things he had never shared with anyone. He spoke about the loneliness he felt, despite all the success, about how he had dedicated so much time to building an empire that he forgot to build a life. He spoke about his parents, who had passed away when he was young, about how he used the pain of that loss as fuel for success, but that in the process he had closed himself off to any kind of deep emotional connection. Christina listened, or rather read his messages, and responded with a wisdom that didn't seem to come only from books or theories, but from the experience of someone who had faced life head-on. She didn't judge, she didn't offer unsolicited advice, she just shared her own perspective, her own battles. She told him that Isabella's father had left when the girl was a baby, that she had to rebuild her life from scratch, that there were moments when she thought she wouldn't make it, but that her daughter gave her the strength to continue. The conversations evolved into phone calls. The first was accidental. Eduardo called to clarify something from a message, and they ended up talking for over an hour. After that, the calls became more frequent. They talked about everything and nothing, about books they had read, movies they liked, childhood memories, dreams for the future. Eduardo discovered that Christina had a sharp sense of humor, a contagious laugh, and a way of seeing the world that was both realistic and hopeful. 3 weeks after the meeting at the restaurant, Eduardo gathered the courage to make an invitation. He said he would like to see Isabella again, that he missed the girl's energy, and asked if they would like to spend a Sunday with him. They could go to a park, get ice cream, something simple. Christina hesitated and Eduardo almost gave up on the idea. But then she agreed. She said that Isabella had also asked about him a few times, wanting to know if they would see Mr. Eduardo again. They scheduled it for the following Sunday. Eduardo woke up that day with an anxiety he hadn't felt in years. He spent more time than usual choosing clothes, opting for something casual that didn't look too casual, but also not too formal. He wanted to look accessible. He wanted Isabella to feel comfortable. He wanted to make a good impression on Christina without looking like he was trying too hard. He arranged to pick them up at the same building where he had dropped them off that night of his birthday. When he arrived, Isabella was already on the sidewalk, jumping with excitement. Upon seeing the car, she ran to it and hugged him as soon as Eduardo got out. It was a spontaneous hug, full of the pure joy that only children can express. Cristina came behind, smiling in that discreet way of hers, but Eduardo could see that she was also happy. They went to Ibirapuera Park, one of the largest and most beautiful in São Paulo. It was a sunny Sunday, and the park was full of families, couples, groups of friends. Eduardo parked and they walked together along the tree-lined trails. Isabella ran ahead, stopping to observe birds, flowers, anything that caught her attention. Cristina and Eduardo went slower, talking, watching the girl with indulgent smiles. Eduardo bought popsicles for the three of them, and they sat on a bench near the lake. Isabella told endless stories about school, about her friends, about a science project she was doing. Eduardo listened with genuine attention, asking questions, showing real interest. Cristina watched the interaction with an expression he couldn't completely decipher, but which seemed to mix gratitude with a hint of apprehension. At one point, Isabella asked to go to the playground. Cristina agreed, but told her to stay where they could see her. The girl ran off, and Eduardo and Cristina were left alone. There was a comfortable silence, just watching Isabella play on the seesaw with other children. Then Cristina spoke without looking directly at Eduardo. She said she needed to ask something, and that he had to be honest. Eduardo felt his heart race, but he agreed. She asked what he really wanted, why he was doing all this, investing time with them, taking an interest in their lives. She said she understood he was a successful man, that he probably had many options for how to spend his time, and that it didn't make sense to choose to spend it with an administrative assistant and her daughter. Eduardo took a deep breath. It was the moment of truth, the time to be completely honest. He said he didn't have a plan, that he wasn't trying to achieve anything specific, that actually, on that birthday night, something had awakened in him. He had realized that he had spent his entire life chasing the wrong things, accumulating success but neglecting connection, and that at that dinner, for the first time in years, he had felt what it was to be genuinely present, genuinely connected with other people. He continued saying that he didn't expect anything from them, that he didn't want to cause discomfort or complications, but that he felt, and he knew it sounded strange, that they had entered his life for a reason. That Isabella, with that simple gesture of the cake, had shown him what true generosity was, and that Cristina, with her dignity and strength, had taught him what it was to have genuine character, that he just wanted the chance to be a part of their lives in whatever way they allowed, without pressure, without expectations beyond genuine friendship. Cristina was silent for a long time, processing what she had heard. Then she looked at him, really looked, as if she were trying to see beyond the words, trying to find the truth in his eyes. And apparently she found something that convinced her, because she said it was okay that they could try, but that it would have to be at her pace, respecting her choices and her independence. Eduardo agreed immediately, relieved and grateful for that chance. The rest of the day passed with a lightness Eduardo hadn't experienced in so long that he had almost forgotten what it was like. They had lunch at a simple restaurant in the park, shared laughs, told stories. Isabella drew a picture of the three of them together on a napkin and gave it to Eduardo as a gift. He kept that napkin with a care he would reserve for his company's most important document. When the sun began to set and it was time to leave, Eduardo felt a genuine sadness. He didn't want the day to end. He didn't want to go back to the empty apartment. But he took the two of them back home, thanked them for the wonderful day, and promised they would talk during the week. Returning home, Eduardo realized that something fundamental had changed. It was no longer just about filling a void. It was about building something new, something real, something that had the potential to become the most important thing in his life. And for the first time in 43 years, Eduardo Mendes was willing to invest his time, his energy, and his heart in something that didn't promise a financial return, but offered something infinitely more valuable: the chance to belong, the chance to matter, the chance to love and be loved back. The months that followed brought changes Eduardo never would have imagined. What began as sporadic meetings on Sundays was transforming into an essential part of his routine. He began picking up Isabella from school a few times a week, coordinating with Cristina for the times that were convenient. The girl always came out radiant upon seeing him waiting at the gate, and Eduardo discovered that that smile of genuine joy was worth more than any praise he had ever received in his career. Isabella introduced him to her classmates as her friend Eduardo, and the other children looked with obvious curiosity at that well-dressed man who appeared in a beautiful car, but played with them as if he were just another normal adult. Eduardo learned to sit on the floor to listen to stories, to make funny voices while reading children's books, to show genuine enthusiasm for drawings Isabella brought from school. With Cristina, the relationship also evolved, but in a more cautious way. She kept her barriers up, protected her space, and made it clear when something bothered her. Eduardo learned to respect those limits, not to push, to let things develop in her time. They talked for hours on the phone after Isabella went to sleep, sharing thoughts, fears, dreams. Cristina revealed layers of herself she had hidden for years, and Eduardo did the same. He spoke for the first time about the emptiness he had always felt, about how he built armor of success to hide the feeling of not belonging anywhere. He spoke about the parents he lost young, about how he channeled the pain into ambition, about how over the years he had distanced himself from everything that was genuinely human. Cristina listened without judging, and then shared her own battles, her own scars. She told him how it was to discover she was pregnant and be abandoned shortly after, how she had to face the pregnancy alone, how she had to set her dreams aside to ensure a future for her daughter. She spoke about the sleepless nights, about the fears of not making it, about the strength she found in places she didn't even know existed within her. And she spoke about how, despite everything, she didn't regret anything, because every difficulty had made her who she was, and she was very proud of that person. Eduardo found himself admiring not only Cristina's strength, but the authenticity with which she lived. She didn't pretend to be someone she wasn't. She didn't try to impress. She didn't wear masks. She was direct, honest, sometimes even harsh in her opinions, but always genuine. It was refreshing, it was real, and Eduardo realized he was developing feelings that went beyond friendship. But he knew he couldn't rush anything, that Cristina needed to get to that place in her own time, if she ever would. Meanwhile, he was becoming part of their daily life in small but significant ways. He fixed a dripping faucet in Cristina's apartment, not because she asked, but because he noticed and wanted to help. He took Isabella to ride her bike in the park and taught the girl to pedal without training wheels, holding the handlebars with patience while she found her balance. He attended the school play where Isabella had a small role, sitting in the audience next to Cristina, applauding as if she were the main star. Cristina, in turn, allowed Eduardo to know a little of her world. She introduced some friends from work when they went to dinner at a simple place she frequented. The friends looked at Eduardo with obvious curiosity, and he knew that Cristina had probably spoken about him. There were discreet questions about what he did, where she knew him from, and he answered naturally, making it clear they were friends, nothing more, respecting whatever Cristina had told them. Eduardo also began to make changes in his own life. He reduced his workload, delegated more responsibilities, and started leaving the office at reasonable hours. His executives were surprised, some even worried, but he explained he was re-evaluating priorities. He discovered that the company worked perfectly well without him being present for every decision, every meeting. He had built a solid structure, and now he could trust it. With the free time he created, Eduardo began doing things he had never done. He cooked simple dinners for Cristina and Isabella at his apartment, discovering there was pleasure in preparing food for people he loved. Yes, loved. He had to admit it to himself, even if he didn't say it out loud. He loved that girl who had welcomed him with such purity, and he loved that woman who was gradually allowing him to know her world. Cristina, in turn, began to accept some help Eduardo offered, but always on terms that preserved her dignity. When he learned she was studying at night for a technical course that could improve her position at work, he offered to pay the tuition. She refused initially, but he argued it would be an investment in someone he believed in, not charity. That if she wanted, she could consider it a loan she would pay back when she was earning better. Cristina finally accepted on those terms, and Eduardo knew she would never fail to pay, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was allowing him to be part of her journey. Isabella thrived with Eduardo's presence. She had someone to talk to about subjects that interested her, someone who took her questions seriously, who stimulated her curiosity. Eduardo helped her with homework, not doing it for her, but teaching her to reason, to seek answers. He bought books he knew she would like, took her to museums, the zoo, exhibitions. Cristina initially resisted so many gifts and outings, but Eduardo explained that he was discovering the world again through Isabella's eyes, and that was priceless. There was a specific moment that marked a turning point in how Cristina saw Eduardo. It was on a common Tuesday, when Isabella got sick at school. Cristina was in an important meeting at work that she couldn't leave and called Eduardo in a panic. He was in a $1 million negotiation but left immediately. He picked up Isabella from school, took her to the doctor, bought the medicine, and stayed with her in the apartment until Cristina arrived, hours later. When Cristina finally arrived, she found Isabella sleeping on the sofa, with Eduardo sitting nearby reading a book, checking the girl's temperature from time to time. The fever had broken, and everything was under control. Cristina thanked him with a choked voice, and Eduardo saw tears in her eyes. They weren't tears of sadness, but of something more complex. Gratitude, perhaps, or the recognition that he really was there for them, with no interest beyond being part of their lives. That night, after Isabella fell asleep again, Eduardo and Cristina talked in the apartment kitchen. She made coffee, and they sat there, drinking in silence for a few minutes. Then Cristina spoke, in a low but firm voice. She said she was scared. Scared because she was getting used to him being there, because Isabella was getting attached, because she herself was starting to feel things she hadn't felt in a long time, and that she was afraid of what would happen if it all collapsed. Eduardo understood perfectly. He said he was also afraid of messing everything up, of not being up to the task, of disappointing them, but that for the first time in his life, he was willing to take that risk, because what he felt for the two of them was real. It was deep, and it was the most important thing that had ever happened to him, that he had no guarantees to offer, no perfect promises, but he had the certainty that he wanted to be there, that he wanted to be part of it, that he wanted to build something true. Cristina looked at him for a long time, and then she did something that surprised him. She took his hand, interlaced her fingers, and stayed like that, just holding it. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. That gesture said everything. It was a yes. It was permission. It was an opening so that what was growing between them could finally have a name and a form. The following weeks brought a new intimacy. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't dramatic, it was organic. They began meeting not just on weekends, but during the week too. Dinners that stretched late, conversations that went from philosophy to the trivial, silences that were comfortable instead of awkward. Isabella noticed the change, and with the intuition of children, asked if Eduardo was her mother's boyfriend. Cristina was embarrassed, but she was honest. She said they were getting to know each other better, that they liked him very much, and that yes, maybe they were becoming more than friends. Isabella was radiant with the answer and declared she thought it was great, because that way Eduardo could stay with them forever. Forever. The word echoed in Eduardo's mind. He had never thought about anything in terms of forever. It was always about the next deal, the next goal, the next achievement. But there, in that improvised family he was building, forever didn't sound scary. It sounded right. It sounded like home. Eduardo began to include Cristina in parts of his life he had never shared with anyone. He took her to see his company, introduced her to some executives, showed her the office from where he commanded an empire. Cristina was impressed, but not intimidated. She asked intelligent questions, observed carefully, and in the end said she understood why he had been successful, but that she was happy that now he was learning that success had many definitions. He also took her to see the apartment where he lived, that space that had always been just a place to sleep. Cristina walked through the large rooms, observed the expensive but impersonal decoration, and tactfully said it was beautiful, but that it lacked life. Eduardo agreed. He said he was thinking of moving, maybe to something smaller, cozier, more like a real home. Cristina smiled and said he would know when he found the right place. But the biggest change wasn't in the physical spaces, it was inside Eduardo. He began to see the world differently. People who were once just employees, clients, business partners, now had stories, families, complex lives. He began to implement changes in the company: wellness programs for employees, flexible hours for parents, social initiatives that went beyond mere public relations. His executives noticed the change, and some commented that he seemed different, more present, more human. Eduardo smiled and said he was learning to live after spending decades just existing, and it was true. He was learning that true wealth was not in bank account numbers, but in Isabella's hugs, in Christina's smiles, in shared dinners, in conversations late into the night, in the small gestures of affection that make life worth living. One night, lying in his empty bed but with a full heart, Eduardo thought about that birthday night that changed everything. He thought about how he was alone, empty, lost, and how two strangers had entered his life and saved him, even without knowing he needed saving. They had shown that true connection isn't about status or money. It's about presence, about generosity, about the willingness to open one's heart. Eduardo took his cell phone and sent a message to Christina. He said simply that he loved her, that he loved Isabella, and that he was grateful every day for that unlikely encounter. Christina replied a few minutes later. She said she also loved him, that she was afraid to say it before but that now she was sure, and that Isabella also loved him in her pure and uncomplicated way. Eduardo slept that night with a smile on his face. For the first time in 43 years, he knew what it meant to be truly rich. And that wealth had nothing to do with the millions in the bank. It had to do with having people who mattered, people who cared about him, people with whom to build a life that made sense. And that, he was discovering, was priceless. A year had passed since that birthday night that changed everything. Eduardo woke up on a September morning and for a few seconds didn't recognize his own life. He was no longer in the cold apartment in Jardins. He was in a house he had bought 6 months ago, a residence in a quiet neighborhood in São Paulo, with a backyard, a porch, and 3 bedrooms. One for him, one for Christina, and one that Isabella had decorated with the help of both, full of color and life. The change had not been abrupt. It was a decision they made together, talking for months about what made sense, about how they wanted to build their lives. Christina had her reservations, concerns about maintaining her independence, about not becoming financially dependent. Eduardo understood perfectly and proposed something different. It wouldn't be him paying for everything. It would be a partnership. She would contribute what she could, keeping her job, her autonomy. He would help with whatever was necessary, but respecting her space. Isabella had been the most enthusiastic about the move. She would finally have a real room, not just the small space she shared with her mother in the old apartment. She could have friends over to sleep. She would have space to play, to grow. And most importantly, she would have a complete family, something she had always dreamed of but never dared to ask for out loud. On that birthday morning, Eduardo went down to the kitchen and found Christina already preparing coffee. She smiled when she saw him, a smile that carried intimacy and complicity. She gave him a good morning kiss, something that never failed to surprise Eduardo with its simplicity and depth. Isabella was still sleeping. It was Saturday and she took the opportunity to rest after an intense week at school. Christina wished him a happy birthday, and Eduardo hugged her tight. He said he could hardly believe the difference of 1 year, how on that same date, 12 months ago, he was completely alone, and now he had everything that really mattered. Christina reminded him in that direct way of hers that it wasn't about having, it was about building together, and he agreed, because she was always right about those things. They spent the morning peacefully, drinking coffee slowly, talking about plans for the day. Eduardo mentioned that he had thought about having a barbecue, inviting a few people. Christina thought it was a good idea and suggested calling her friends from work and some of Eduardo's colleagues he had reconnected with in recent months. Yes, he had done that too. He had sought out old friends he had neglected over the years, apologized, rebuilt bridges. Not everyone accepted him back, but some did, and that was enough. Isabella woke up around 10, came into the kitchen still in her pajamas and jumped into Eduardo's lap. She wished him a happy birthday with that enthusiasm only she had, and handed him a card she had made at school. It was a drawing of the 3 of them, holding hands, with the house in the background and a huge sun in the sky. Below, in that irregular child's handwriting, It was written, "To the best father in the world." Eduardo felt his eyes sting. Isabella still didn't call him father out loud, but that card said everything. The day was spent in preparations for the barbecue. Eduardo discovered he liked those things: lighting the grill, seasoning the meat, preparing the house to receive people. Cristina made salads, Isabella helped as she could, and there was a collective joy in that preparation that made everything worth it. The guests began to arrive in the middle of the afternoon. Cristina's friends from work, strong and talkative women who treated Eduardo with a mixture of curiosity and approval. 2 of Eduardo's colleagues from college, friends he had reunited with and who were surprised by the changes they saw in him. Some mothers of Isabella's schoolmates, whom Cristina had become close to. It was a diverse group, mixing worlds that before would never touch, and it worked perfectly. During the barbecue, Eduardo had a conversation that marked him deeply. One of his college friends, Miguel, pulled him aside and said he almost didn't recognize him. Not physically, but in essence. He said the Eduardo of before was ambitious, focused, but also distant, almost robotic in his pursuit of success, and that now there was a lightness, a presence, a humanity that didn't exist before. Eduardo thanked him for the comment and confessed that he himself sometimes didn't recognize himself, that he had spent so much time being a person he thought he should be, that he had forgotten who he really was, and that Cristina and Isabella had helped him find his way back. Miguel smiled and said he envied that in a healthy way, because it showed it was never too late to change, to find what really mattered. Later, when the sun was already setting and the backyard lights were turned on, Isabella gathered everyone and said she had a surprise. She brought a cake, not bought this time, but made by her and Cristina during the morning while Eduardo was busy with other things. It was a simple cake, a bit crooked, with frosting running down one side, but it was perfect. Isabella placed a candle in the center and everyone sang happy birthday. Eduardo blew out the candle under applause and cheers. And this time, when he closed his eyes to make a wish, he didn't ask to fill a void. He asked for the wisdom to preserve what he had built, to be worthy of the love he received, to continue growing as a person. And he asked for the health and happiness of Cristina and Isabella, the 2 people who had completely transformed his life. After the guests left and Isabella went to sleep exhausted from playing so much, Eduardo and Cristina sat on the porch. The night was calm, and they could hear the sounds of the neighborhood, children playing in the street, distant conversations, life happening all around. Eduardo held Cristina's hand and said he had something to say. Cristina looked worried, but Eduardo quickly reassured her. He said it wasn't anything bad, on the contrary. He said he had been thinking a lot about the future, about legacy, about what he really wanted to leave in the world, and that he had made some decisions he would like to share with her. First, he said he was creating a foundation. Not one of those shell foundations that businessmen create to pay less tax, but something real, with true purpose. It would be focused on helping single mothers, offering financial, educational, and professional support. It would help with housing, daycare, professional training. It would be based on Cristina's story, on her strength, on the resilience she showed. And Cristina would be involved, if she wanted, helping to shape the programs, ensuring they really made a difference. Cristina was silent, processing. Then she asked why. Eduardo answered simply, because she had shown it was possible, that with proper support, people could not only survive but thrive, because he had resources that could make a difference, and he had finally learned that money only had value when used for something meaningful, and because he wanted his legacy to be about helping people, not about accumulating more wealth. Cristina wiped away a tear that fell and said she thought it was beautiful, that she was in, that she had many ideas about what would really make a difference for women in the situation she had been in. Eduardo smiled, relieved by her approval, and said he had one more thing. He was restructuring his will, not because he expected anything to happen, but because it was the responsible thing to do, and he wanted to ensure that Cristina and Isabella were protected, always. No matter what happened between them, the bond they had was permanent, and he wanted to make sure they never faced financial difficulties again. Cristina began to protest, saying it wasn't about money, that wasn't why she was with him. But Eduardo gently interrupted her. He said he knew that, he never doubted that. but that this was his right, to ensure that the people he loved was safe. That it wasn't about buying affection or creating dependence, it was about responsibility, about taking care of his own. They talked for hours on that porch about the future, about dreams, about fears. Christina confessed that sometimes she was still afraid that everything was temporary, that she would wake up and discover it had just been a dream. Eduardo said he had the same fear, but that they were building something solid, something real, and that they would face any challenge together. They spoke about marriage, not as something immediate, but as a future possibility. Christina said she wanted to be sure. She wanted Isabella to have time to fully adapt. She wanted it to be at the right time for everyone. Eduardo agreed, saying he was in no hurry, that the important thing was being together, that the official paperwork would come when it made sense. That night, lying next to Christina, Eduardo reflected on the journey he had made. From a lonely and empty man to someone who had a family, a purpose, a reason to wake up every day beyond making more money. He had discovered that true transformation doesn't happen from the outside in, but from the inside out. It wasn't moving apartments or routines that changed him. It was opening his heart, allowing himself to be vulnerable, accepting that he needed other people. He thought of Isabella, sleeping in the room next door, safe and loved. He thought about how that child, with a simple gesture of kindness, had planted a seed of change that grew and flourished into something beautiful. He thought of Christina by his side, breathing softly in sleep, this strong woman who had allowed him to be part of her life despite all the reasons she had to be suspicious. Eduardo realized that the birthday a year ago hadn't been just another date. It had been a turning point, the moment his real life had begun. Everything before that was just preparation, a long journey through the desert until finding the oasis. And now, finally home, finally complete, Eduardo Mendez could say with absolute certainty that he was happy. Not happy despite the circumstances, but happy because of them, because of the choices he made, the people he chose to love and who chose him back. He fell asleep with a smile, grateful for everything, especially grateful for that night a year ago when there was no room for him in a restaurant, and two generous strangers offered not just a chair, but a chance to be reborn. And he had taken that chance with everything he had, building not just a new life, but a new version of himself, a version that finally understood what it meant to be truly rich. 5 years had passed since that transformative night at the restaurant. Eduardo was on the porch of the house, watching the backyard where Isabella, now 13, was playing with a dog they had adopted 6 months ago. The girl had grown, she was entering adolescence, but she maintained that generous and curious essence that always defined her. Christina was beside him, her hair tied back practically, a quiet smile on her face as she watched her daughter. The foundation Eduardo had created was thriving beyond all expectations. It wasn't just a project, it had become a real movement. Hundreds of single mothers had received support, not just financial, but structural. Dignified housing, quality daycare, professional training programs, psychological support. Christina coordinated much of the operations, using her own experience to shape programs that really made a difference. She had left her job as an administrative assistant and now worked full-time at the foundation, finally doing what really mattered. Eduardo had drastically changed his role in the company. He remained the owner, but had handed over operational management to competent executives. He dedicated only a few hours a week to business, enough to follow strategic decisions, but nothing that consumed his life as before. The rest of the time he invested in the foundation, in family, in projects that had real meaning. He had also started a mentoring program, connecting young entrepreneurs from underprivileged communities with established businessmen. He used his network of contacts no longer just to close deals, but to open opportunities for those who never had them. And he discovered that this was the most rewarding part of everything he had achieved, seeing other people reach their dreams with a little support at the right time. The house had become a true home. Walls that were once white and empty were now full of photos, Isabella's drawings from various ages, memories of trips they took together. They weren't expensive and ostentatious trips. They were simple outings through Brazil, visiting cities, beaches, mountains, building memories that were worth more than any international destination could offer. Isabella had become a conscious and engaged teenager. She volunteered at the foundation, helping to organize activities for the children of the mothers who were served. She maintained excellent grades in school and still dreamed of being a veterinarian, but now with a more concrete plan, wanting to work with animals from low-income families. Eduardo and Cristina supported every dream, every plan, knowing they were raising not just a daughter, but a person who would make a difference in the world. The relationship between Eduardo and Cristina had matured beautifully. It wasn't perfect. They had disagreements, difficult moments, but they faced everything with open communication and mutual respect. They had married 2 years ago in a simple ceremony with close friends and family. Isabella was the flower girl, radiant in a dress she helped choose, and gave a moving speech about how happy she was to finally have a complete family. That afternoon on the porch, Eduardo received a call. It was his lawyer confirming that the final documents were ready. Eduardo thanked him and hung up. He looked at Cristina and said they needed to talk to Isabella about something important. Cristina nodded, knowing what it was about, as they had discussed this decision extensively. They called Isabella inside. The girl came in with the dog behind her, curious about what they wanted. They sat in the living room, and Eduardo began to speak. He said he had something to tell her, something important. Isabella became serious, noticing the solemn tone. Eduardo explained that he had been organizing his legal matters, especially regarding inheritance and the future. He said he wanted to make sure everything was documented correctly, that there would be no doubts or problems in the future. Isabella listened attentively, not yet fully understanding where this was going. Then Eduardo said he had processed her legal adoption, that now officially in the eyes of the law and the world, she was his daughter, not just in the heart, not just in practice, but legally. Her surname would be Mendez if she wanted. She would be the heir to everything he had built, not because he expected recognition, but because it was right, because she was his daughter in every sense that mattered. Isabella was silent for a moment, processing. Then her eyes filled with tears and she threw herself into Eduardo's arms. She said she had always seen him as a father, since that first night at the restaurant when he was kind to them, when he treated her with respect and affection. She said it would be an honor to be officially his daughter, that she wanted his surname, that she was happy in a way she couldn't express in words. Cristina was also crying watching that scene. Eduardo hugged them both, his family, and felt a completeness that went beyond anything he had ever experienced. That moment, that hug, those tears of happiness were worth more than all the millions he had accumulated, more than all the awards he had received, more than any professional recognition. That night, after Isabella went to sleep still emotional with the news, Eduardo and Cristina talked about the journey they had made. They remembered that night at the restaurant how everything seemed unlikely, almost impossible. A lonely millionaire, a struggling mother and her generous daughter, 3 strangers who met by chance and built a family. Cristina said she often thought about what would have happened if she had refused the invitation that night, if she had let distrust win. Eduardo said he thought the same thing, about what his life would have been if he had simply left the restaurant, gone home and continued his empty existence. But they didn't make those choices. They chose courage, they chose openness, they chose to believe that sometimes strangers can become family. Eduardo reflected on how he had changed. The man he was 5 years ago no longer existed. The one who measured success only in money, who believed that human connections were secondary, who lived isolated in his tower of material achievements. Now he understood that all of that was just an empty shell. True success was there in that house, in those people, in that love he received and learned to give back. He thought of the foundation, the hundreds of lives that were being transformed, every mother who received support, every child who gained opportunities, every family that restructured with dignity. It was the legacy that really mattered. He wouldn't be remembered as the businessman who accumulated millions, but as someone who used those resources to make a real difference. Cristina shared that she had also changed. She said that before Eduardo's presence, she lived just surviving, focused only on ensuring the basics for Isabella. She didn't allow herself to dream. She didn't allow herself to believe that life could be more than a sequence of challenges to be overcome. Eduardo had taught her that it was possible to have both, the dignity of her own struggle and the support of someone who loves. that accepting help was not weakness, it was wisdom, that building together was stronger than building alone. The following years brought more growth, more moments of simple beauty. Isabella graduated from high school with honors, entered an excellent veterinary college with a merit-based scholarship. Eduardo was in the audience, next to Cristina, when Isabella went up on stage to receive her diploma, and he felt a pride he had never experienced in any of his own professional achievements. The foundation expanded to other cities, always maintaining the same principles: dignity, respect, real empowerment. Cristina became a national reference in support programs for single mothers, gave lectures, and was consulted by governments and other organizations. She used her story not as a cause for shame, but as a testimony that with proper support, anyone can not only survive, but thrive. Eduardo further reduced his participation in business, eventually selling a majority stake in the company, but keeping enough to ensure permanent financial stability. He used the money from the sale to expand the foundation even further and create a fund that would guarantee its operation for generations. He wanted the impact to continue long after him, for the legacy to be permanent. On his 50th birthday, 7 years after that transformative night, Eduardo threw a party. Not an ostentatious celebration, but a gathering of all the people who had been part of his transformation journey. Mothers the foundation had helped, their families, friends he had reconnected with, colleagues from the foundation, and of course Cristina and Isabella. During the party, Isabella, now 15, gave a speech. She spoke about how she vaguely remembered that night at the restaurant, about how her mother taught her that generosity doesn't need to be big to be significant, about how a simple little cake with a candle had changed 3 lives completely, and about how she was grateful every day for having made that decision to use her savings to make someone happy, because in return she had gained a father, a structured family, and a deep understanding of what really matters in life. Eduardo listened to that speech with tears in his eyes. He hugged Isabella tight, thanked everyone for their presence, and said that the true birthday gift he had already received years ago when 2 generous people invited him to sit at their table, that everything since then was a consequence of that act of pure kindness, and that he hoped to spend the rest of his life honoring that gift by trying to do the same for others. That night, lying next to Cristina, Eduardo reflected on the complete journey, from an empty and lonely man to someone truly rich, rich in love, in purpose, in meaningful connections. He had learned that true wealth is not in accumulating, but in sharing. It's not in conquering alone, but in building together. It's not in having more, but in being more. He thought of that night 7 years ago, when he walked into a restaurant just wanting to escape loneliness for a few hours. How he didn't imagine it would be the beginning of everything, that 2 strangers would become his family, that a simple gesture of kindness would plant a seed that would grow into something so beautiful and meaningful. Eduardo fell asleep grateful. Grateful for that unlikely encounter, grateful for having had the courage to accept the invitation, grateful for having allowed his heart to open, grateful for Cristina and Isabella having given him not only love, but the opportunity to become a better version of himself, and grateful for finally understanding after 5 decades of life that the greatest miracles are not born from material abundance, but from the capacity to share, to welcome, to love. The story of Eduardo, Cristina, and Isabella is a testament that it's never too late to change, to find what really matters, to build a life with meaning. It's proof that sometimes a single gesture of kindness can transform destinies, create eternal bonds, and completely redefine what it means to be truly rich, and that in the end, the wealth that really matters is not measured in numbers, but in hugs, in smiles, in shared moments, in lives touched, in love given and received. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Eduardo, Cristina, and Isabella has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of transformation and discovery of the true meaning of wealth, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment marked you the most. Was it little Isabella's gesture with the cake, Cristina's dignity in refusing help, Eduardo's transformation upon discovering he had everything but had nothing? Every day we bring intense stories like this, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul, and remind us that life's greatest treasures are not in material achievements, but in the true connections we build. We wait for you in the next